Greetings, everybody. Grocery delivery fresh coming at you. I want to start today with a quote. Um, it's from something that Sid put in the Jam Culture channel and given the context today on internet age institutions and the physical presence that our friends Jesse and Tao have been working on in the city of Vancouver. We wanted to talk about this myth 34 out of the busted 50 internet myths. It says that there is no there on the internet is the myth. And the myth says, and this comes from Brewster Kahl's language, I think. Well, he kind of like has this analogy that we saw in the last module in Take Back the Web, where he says the web is not a global village, but a globe of villages. And so this myth kind of continues down that thought where it says the internet is a global village, shrinking the world down to a single global marketplace and social sphere where everyone meets and all have access to the same services. This virtual world, this cyberspace, is one shared place that is separate from all the places in the real world. And then it says busted. We can no longer say that the virtual is clearly distinguishable from the real, the offline from the online. Now that over half the world's population is connected to the internet, most of our lives are accompanied by digital information overlays that augment our daily experience, that shape our understanding of the world and our actions in the world, no matter where in the world we are. Goes on to say, at the same time, many global regions remain disconnected, in particular rural and remote areas. There is stark global inequality in the cost of connectivity in many countries. The cost of broadband still exceeds monthly average salaries. There's a global imbalance in potential digital participation, which is an imbalance in the capacity to participate and shape life online. At the same time, where the early internet was once predominantly in North America, we now see the emergence of a pluriverse of parallel digital cultures. Many of the world's regions, platforms have emerged that are not a part of the Western canon. And I'll just skip ahead to the truth. The truth says the internet is not a global village. Rather, it is a network that augments life in many places. If we want to understand what the internet, in quotes, looks like, we need to be fluent in at least dozens of global cultures. Internet researchers are only ever researching particular digital neighborhoods. Distance still matters, and it will continue to do so. And so that's where we kind of start this week. For the benefit of our guests, who I'm really excited to introduce, and for the benefit of conversation, just want to say, like, we're really grateful to be at this moment in KB9. We're halfway through. We've started to see people share their crafts, their ideas in kernel, and beyond these distinctions, we've started to get to know just the group that's here, that's coming, and that's engaging in the dialogue. Today, as with every fireside, we hope that it's going to be a variety of voices. So we'll get into like a few questions and thoughts, and then we'll hopefully get to like 10, 15, 20 voices by the end of the call. And I want to ask Sid, maybe Alia, to put in a note on Expo. Tomorrow is the actual last day to RSVP. We have some great peer mentors and peers who are going to come to be in dialogue. Everyone who signs up and puts in a craft artifact, it'll be the halfway point in kernel. It'll be like very much a work in progress, show and tell, science fair style moment. And we're really excited for it. Next week, it's August 20th, 21st, and 23rd, which is Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday. It's RSVP for any one of those 3 days if you haven't yet. And just share whatever it is that's like currently the point that you sit within the work that you're exploring. Our collective like kernel experience is basically made up of the interesting ideas and things that we can learn from each other. And so Expo becomes this really awesome spot for that. So really excited. A very important point is even if you feel for whatever reason that you don't want RSVP, come and like see what other people are up to, join a room that seems compelling or interesting to you. For every single day, we're going to just kind of have descriptions of everyone who's sharing, and then a choice of which room anyone wants to hop into in each day of Expo. So that's where we are in KB9. We're halfway through the syllabus, and we're on the part where we're thinking about governance, institutions, and identity. And so I'm going to skip ahead to the way that the internet affects institutions. As we describe it in the module, we say the internet affects institutions across 3 spheres of human life, namely how we identify ourselves, how we reach consensus, and how we experience time. And so I want to have those 3 things in our minds. Identifying ourselves is how we reach consensus and how we experience time. And so I think I just kind of want to like get into it with Christo here, because his approach in kernel block 8 was really when it started, and it's continued in kernel block 9 with his craft as a returning fellow, is to be focused on identity and networked identity, and really fits with the myth that we started with, and maybe kicks us off well. I remember talking to him about this brief that's included in this week's module. So we're in module 4. It's this one on who are you, which combines 2, we think, really interesting resources. One that's found on the Internet Archive these days, Inventories Not Identities by Kia Kreutler, which was written a while ago, and then Identity R&D by Aaron Lewis. And what they talk about in this is the idea that composable identity approaches identity as inherently relational, rather than identities on Web3, we might have inventories. And so I want to pass it to Christo. He's been thinking about this quite a bit. Christo, if you prefer, I can share slides, or I can also stop my share and have you.
Cool. I'll be happy to share the slides as well. But it's super good to be with you, all the fellows and the peers. So my name's Christo, calling in from Amsterdam, and in KB8, I've been geeking out about digital identity. My entire craft was inspired by Kia Kreutler, the module that Vivek just shared, module 4. And I went in deep, and for some context, I always found it really hard to belong to one isolated thing. And for some personal context, I'm Dutch, Indian, lived many years in China, so I've been part of multiple worlds and learned to like bridge them over time. So this whole thing of like personal identity was very close to me. And so over KB8, what I've done is I've actually took a few fellows, 20 odd fellows, through a meditative journey to really tune in towards how they relate to topics like identity, self or selves, how they connect to different communities they're part of, and also how they connect to their digital world, and kind of like map that out. And KB9, this one, I'm connecting a few more dots. So I've been jamming a lot with Sid about how we can learn and perhaps even find interconnections between computer networks and personal identity and agency. So today's little brief would be about connecting the dots and really finding that balance. And kind of like taking a historic view, Sid came up with this. The predecessor of the internet was ARPANET, and what they did really well is looking at different disparate operating systems and seeing how they could communicate better with each other. So the question that we started exploring is, how could we map this over to the human level and perhaps navigate our coordination challenges? So how could we learn from computer networks and then look at identity and agency? So now, moving on, I think the time is really to geek out about a few things. I'd like to geek out about context, because that's going to be very key for agency. Number 2 is looking at OSI abstractions. Sid came up with this, and then also looking at blockchain layers and eventually how that could translate to the human level. So if we look at this picture, it comes from the mycelium network. It's what we find in ecology. And every little part, every connection contributes to the whole, right? And I want you to remember that in the backdrop as we think about internet age institutions, but also identity in a networked age. So if we kind of like move on, I think we could look at a pathetic dot, and that is the individual, the agent. On the one end, you can say like we actually don't have a lot of agency. We're actually influenced by governments, corporations, rules, etc. And that might be true, but you can also look at that pathetic dot and consider it to be less pathetic, that it actually has agency at the individual level and can co-create and interact with these other forces. So there's this really cool piece about evolution, not revolution. And then you could see how the agent, the individual, can influence technology, economics, policy, culture in their direct spheres of influence. And if we kind of like move on from this, it's then cool to kind of like geek out about the layer of technology and computers. So this is actually an OSI abstraction, and you can geek out about all of this with Sid, but there are multiple layers. And what I want you to think about is this layered structure. So on the basic level, there's the physical layer, the data layer, the network layer, and then you can like go all the way to the application layer. And you can actually look at blockchain layers and have something similar. You have layer 0, a foundational layer. You have layer 1, a protocol layer. Layer 2, like an extended network layer, and then an application layer. And the little caveat here is when I talk with a lot of my ETH maxis and friends, they're like, oh, this doesn't really exist or doesn't really translate well because it's really about layer 1, layer 2, and extended layers of 2. So depending on who you talk to, you might want to like have a little caveat. But I think the cool thing, what we're trying to explore here is how does this all translate to the human level? And this is kind of like new, but I want you to think about it in reverse. An example that I give is a lot with, let's say you're an investment banker. It starts with the application of being an investment banker. And then you translate that to what networks are you typically part of? Well, typically your colleagues. And that also influences your protocols. So typically there's this Friday night where you drink a lot and you go out and you have that kind of like thing. And eventually, if you really think about your philosophy, what drives you, you might not have time in between 80 hours of work, partying on Friday and then coming back to the office at 6 in the morning. So the invitation here is to really flip it and learn from these different layers of computer networks, where you start with the foundational layer, your layer 0. So at the human level, what is your philosophy? Do you know what your, anchor point is for the future? What drives you? What are your values and things like that? And how does that then inspire your protocols, your practices, and how you navigate your world? And that could be your health. It could be also like certain rules in terms of when you do focused work or when you free flow and things like that. And then from there, what are the embedded networks you're part of? Well, you're part of kernel, and there's an intention towards that. Well, what other networks are aligned to your philosophy? And then how do you then uniquely apply yourself in different contexts? And I think this is kind of like something to think about. So really flipping it and really looking at your layer 0. And especially in an age of internet age institutions, you might be wondering like, okay, what's the relevance of all of this? And I think it's cool to look at Jack Dorsey. He spoke at the Festival of Freedom in June, and he really talked about give people more agency and how you can then direct your energy or your attention. And my take on that is like be thoughtful of where you want to direct your energy towards and really look at your layer 0. And especially when we think about interconnected worlds and internet age institutions, and that we're all like nodes connected to one another, it's going to be important to understand what your layer 0 might be and really be, thoughtful about it, articulate it so you can make better decisions. But this is kind of like an ongoing dialogue. So an open invitation is to continue jamming on this topic. So somewhere at the end of August, we'll do a convo and really think about your philosophical foundations, your layer 0. And we'll talk about things like your core values, your personal philosophies, and how that can then interconnect within your own mycelium network. So yeah, these are a few of the ongoing like topics that we're jamming about together with Sid and a few others. And again, I invite you to continue to do the same.
It's good stuff. Yeah. I greatly appreciate the approach, and yeah, there's a few nuggets in there that they're not common. Give people more agency how they direct your energy and attention, regardless of Jack or not, which is kind of nice to have his face. It's like it's not a message that's quite common these days. That there's so much about protecting our energy and attention, which is fine, but there's a there's a different approach there, which is to find the places where you are willing and it feels right to give more agency and attention. And I do want to just kind of introduce Jesse and Tao with that in mind. Tao is with us in KB5, and it's so wonderful to have her back with us. We got to meet Jesse through Benny Jiang and some Colonel Fellows from KB7 when we visited Vancouver. And 221A was something that we had heard about on our periphery, but had maybe not gotten to experience. And I think the way that that trip unfolded was basically due to the graciousness of Jesse, just more and more time feeling like we were getting a inside glimpse into the city of Vancouver, the way that 221A functions as an internet age institution in a very localized sense, and just like a real pleasant feeling. Whereas like, okay, we're really doing things that are hyper local. We've spent a bit of time at the Vancouver Public Library, and then we're going to 221A, which we'll have Jesse and Tao talk about, which is a very embedded institution in the city. But we're also talking at like great depth about ideas that we spend a lot of time in crypto and on the internet. And it's just like one of those things that it feels like a gift, and it feels like the type of thing that you decide of your own volition, like you want to do more of. And so that kind of brings us to today, because we wanted to continue really what had already been a long dialogue with Jesse that really grateful to have started in Vancouver, and having Tao, who is the producer of Strategic Initiatives and also member of Kernel, with us. It's just a joy. So we want to start by just welcoming Jesse and Tao, but also with a question, which is just what can you tell us about 221A? What can you tell us about the practices and customs that make it up?
That's great. Thank you so much, Vivek. Nice to see you and meet everyone here today. So, I guess it's important to name where we're calling in from. And there's Alia as well. Hey, you were in Vancouver as well on that trip. Only it feels like it was like months ago, but it was literally this season. So that's how fast time moves in real life a bit. But yeah, where we were is in Canada on the west coast, just above Seattle. We were in Vancouver. It's about 2 hours drive north of Seattle, just across the border. Right on the water, and I think that's an important place to start, is that we come out of a particular locality. We come out of a rather young city. The city's only 130 years old. Yes, that's right, the birds are chirping with me as well, so if anything gets distracting, I usually work in the garden in the summer, so let me know. And I think what's important to know about Vancouver is maybe I can just show you a few things about the city, and then give you a sense of what Vivek was talking about. So there we are, that's our downtown peninsula, surrounded by the North Shore Mountains, and 221A is located, our headquarters is located around here, but we have a network that stretches into a few properties kind of in the downtown, and then more so on the east side of the city in Chinatown and into the industrial area. But what's important to know about Vancouver is that we're on unceded Indigenous territories, and that's something that the city understands, and that they are working diligently towards reconciliation reconciliation, so everybody in the city should be doing the same. But it's the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So at 221A, we take that further and recognize that the colony of British Columbia, which is the province that Vancouver is situated within, was created through organized dispossession and colonial violence. And so we seek to shift its organizational practices to work with Indigenous people to end ongoing violence, dispossession, and displacement. And so what that means is at 221A and many institutions and the city's government itself, we're all big supporters of UNDRIP, the United Nations Declarations for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and we work to see that vision through and to find reconciliation with the Indigenous people of the territory. This is a bit, so the map is a bit down today for some reason, it's developer poor, but we have a couple locations across the city. So where we met everybody from Colonel was here at our headquarters downtown at 825 Pacific, but we also have other studio buildings across the city that house artists that provide mostly for their studios. So it's not live work. So in Vancouver, it's pretty much you've gotta separate commercial and residential property. There's reasons for that, and so most of our spaces are studios. We do have some housing, so we've just started to do housing here with the City of Vancouver, which is an effort to look at public housing or social housing, but with artists as a particular subsect of that, because we recognize them as kind of a low-income constituency, and there are equity reasons to do that as well for our community. And we do more than just that. So how we look at our stack is we are workspaces, we are housing for some folks, we operate a fellowship program for artists, designers, curators, writers for long-term support. That feeds into a physical library where the fellows' research is kept, and so we have individual collections in that library. It's not a comprehensive library, but it kind of documents the history of our fellows in some ways. And then we have a garden called the Hao Shui, New Growth, or Sung Sung Lum. And that is a garden that's stewarded by a group of Indigenous young folks, and that was envisioned by an ethnobotanist and artist, Toitstanat Siswais, who is of territory. There we go. There's a more updated photo of all of our team, just at the opening of our new building in May, where Vivek and Alia met with us, and Future Primitive. So large team. So I've been with 221A for about, I would say almost 10 years now. So I've seen the team grow from 4 of us to this, and this does include some board members and some fellows as well. So it's a large roster of folks who all work together to make this possible. And I want to shout out a major project that's going on with us. It's kind of like, you can try to imagine 221A or research and development more like it's kind of like a venture studio, but for civil society. So a major project that's coming out of us right now is called the Cultural Land Trust. And so Vancouver, we just hosted the Olympics were just big news in Paris, of course. But in Vancouver, we hosted them in 2010. But what happened after that was a steep incline in rents, about 30% annually, after the Olympics came through, because of all of the development and stuff that happens. And so Vancouver has a history of becoming a real estate kind of mecca because of mega events. And so in the mid 80s we hosted a World Expo, and it kind of started that first flash wave of international kind of capital coming in and redeveloping the city. And then about 25 years later the Olympics come, and then that kind of exponentially grows that. And so since the Olympics happened in 2010, Vancouver lost about 400,000 square feet of cultural use space. And so looking at community needs, we're trying to reclaim that space, but give the community like a long-term hold and not just kind of chase our own tails. So we're looking at how do we assemble cultural properties under a similar portfolio, so that we can focus philanthropy, fundraising, advocacy, regulation, taxation, so we can start to have larger conversations as a major stakeholder in the city, through a portfolio of properties. We owe our histories to a few pillars. So I'd say the Artist Run Center Network is a very important pillar that 221A grows out of. And that's a network of self-organized artist-run spaces that existed across the country that were funded by the federal government from the 1960s onwards, as well as provincial governments, and then local fundraising efforts as well. But that kind of like grant system really enabled local spaces to have independence and create very unique art scenes that didn't need to rely at the time on commercial markets or worry about making art that was commercially viable per se, because the economy was different then. And we had these grants and costs were lower, and artists could, like this newspaper from the 1970s shows us, in Vancouver, the Georgia Strait, it shows us that artists could pool their money together by selling their cars and buying an old building and fixing it up, whereas like now that's unimaginable in our city because we have the property values of Palo Alto, but we have the incomes of Columbus, Ohio. So nowhere in North America is the gap between income and living cost greater. So we've been living on that spear's edge of the spatial crisis, the livability crisis. Most of the North America is feeling it in the past, 10 years or so, but I'd say since 2010, Vancouver's really been kind of diagnosed with that. So we're looking at the long history of these artist-run spaces, which are very communal, which are very generative, but they also teach us about networks. And so what these folks were doing back in the 1960s and 70s by buying equipment, having spaces together, were distributing their work around the world, videotapes, zines, postcards, that sort of stuff. And it was a self-organized way of creating an international art world. And it comes out of many traditions, and it connects Vancouver to places like Berlin, London, New York, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore, all those sorts of places. And so we really understood our locality as a place to distribute our learnings and our understandings, and to welcome new people and to understand that space. And so that local internationalism of the art world is inherited by 221A. We also owe our history. This is one of our buildings in Chinatown, 222 East Georgia Street, that we rent. But it was across the street from our original location, which we no longer inhabit, which was 221A East Georgia Street. But this is a very special building because it's something that we work with a Chinese Benevolent Society to operate, and so it's their property, and we've leased it for as long as I can remember, since I've been at 221A at least. It dates up there, since 2011. But a Chinese Benevolent Society is a very important heritage for us because our founders are Chinese Canadian, Brian McKee and Michelle Fu. And it's through their family relationships that 221A got a foothold in the city, because they were a student collective that graduated out of our art college here called Emily Carr, the University, Emily Carr University of Art and Design. And this group then found collective space in spaces like Chinatown that was accessible through Brian and Michelle's family connections. And benevolent societies were set up at the turn of the 20th century in order to protect newcomers from China from racist laws and from exclusionary laws that didn't allow people of Asian heritage to rent or own property. And so Chinese benevolent societies would pool resources together under family names, like the Yis in this case, the Yi Feng Toy Society of Canada. And they would then create a nonprofit society that could exist legally within Canada and that could own property, and then it could then make concessions within the law in the city to create space for their community to persist and to generate wealth. And so through Chinese benevolent societies, they're kind of the DNA of why North America has such a strong network of Chinatowns. And so these societies are also a heritage point for us, and it kind of explains why we take such a position to kind of provide the infrastructure for our community, because it's in need right now. There's a lot of threats, there's a lot of hardship, and so we need to kind of band together, squad together, kind of get through it. And so now we're at a point where we're looking at working with these societies, which are old and rather ossified because there's not a young membership. It's a lot of Chinese seniors who live in this building. They have a meeting space, and that's shared with a gallery and a couple of artist studios in the background as well. And so now we're looking at doing a redevelopment of this space and trying to get and trying to negotiate ways for the benevolent society to work with partners like the federal government and the city government, because there's always been quite a distance between them. And so we're playing a bit of kind of diplomatic roles and ombudsmanship kind of between those two networks and those two worlds. And so we're looking at redeveloping the property with them retaining ownership and looking at a 99-year lease where we could create community space and cultural space for both of our communities for the next 100 years at least. And then from my own background, I'd say there was a particular brand of curating that I was trained in from the 2010s. I studied in London at the Royal College of Art in curatorial studies, and that was really formative. We were one group all working together for 2 years, not an individual pursuit. But at that time, what was really interesting in Northern Europe and England was this trend called new institutionalism. And what we were looking at was, can institutions, art institutions, be spaces to be laboratories for new forms of democracy, for forms of governance that can kind of help us survive what we're going through. So this is a very iconic exhibition from the time, from an exhibition in the Rosa Museum in Malmo in Sweden, done by Charles Esch. I'd highly recommend looking it up. There's going to be some trouble. A whole house will need rebuilding. But other institutions that came out of this is like the Palais de Tokyo in Paris, if you know it. Nicolas Bourriaud was a famous curator from that. And so why I bring up Bourriaud as well is he's quite interesting as a figure, but recently is quite critical of the art world. And, you know, since I left art college, the art world's become flooded with international finance capital. Quantitative easing was not nice on the art world. It created a huge bubble. A lot of young artists got burned. The quality of the discourse is, you know, not what it used to be, I'd say. And, you know, we're looking at, if anybody follows the art world, the Venice Biennial this year, the majority of the artists in the international exhibition of the Venice Biennial were dead. And I don't remember a time when, you know, biennials started to behave like museums. So we're always looking at the art world to kind of foment our culture and kind of push us forward a little bit. And there are some tendencies in modernism that make me say that's not always such a good drive. But at the same time, Bourriaud is writing like, you know, the exhibition, which was called Foreigners Everywhere, delivers a statement that contemporary art has become a global but compartmentalized safe space designed to preserve the world as it was, rather than for inventing what it might become. And so for those reasons, we work deeply at 221A thinking about the social, cultural, and ecological kind of underpinnings of our world and our societies. And so that led us many years ago, back in 2018, to start looking at blockchain technologies early on. And so this is a report we published during the pandemic in 2021, where we had this research cluster kind of looking at the implications of an integrated technology like blockchain and the network systems that we live within already. So that led us towards a digitally cooperative culture where we are thinking about recommoning land, data, and objects. So there's a bunch of essays in there. There's some values kind of work that's done. There's some resources there to kind of look at about our background. And then I'll throw it over to Tao, who can talk briefly about the project we're building right now, which is called the Node Library.
Hey everyone. Yeah, so I'm Tao. I'm the producer of strategic initiatives at 221A. I've been working with Jesse since 2020, was a COVID hire. But yeah, so as Jesse was saying, you know, the sort of culminating proof of concept from that multi-year research phase of blockchains and cultural padlocks is the Node Library. So the digital arm has sort of grown into this new entity that we're developing as a nonprofit learning center and prototyping lab that will operate and steward decentralized web infrastructure for the collective advancement of the cultural, education, and public sectors in the digital realm. What this means in concrete terms is that the Node Library will house physical server infrastructure, running nodes and validators across a variety of public blockchains and peer-to-peer networks, as well as participating in these emerging DePIN networks. So those are decentralized physical infrastructure networks, networks distributing, hardware-backed resources such as compute, storage, connectivity. And we are thinking is that these, by operating on a local basis, these compute resources, as well as participating meaningfully in these decentralized networks, will be able to develop and tailor digital services for aligned community and builders, and also to sort of create the socio-technical conditions to be able to serve, our communities more closely to where they are, and to build community benefit technologies. And of course, 221A being an arts and culture organization, we're looking specifically at artistic and cultural use cases. And so we are, seeding this node library in our newest cultural facility. So if you remember back to the map that Jesse was showing, it was the cultural facility in downtown Vancouver, which is a zero emissions passive house certified facility. And so this is where we're going to be housing this server infrastructure, and operating it alongside early academic and technical partners, one of whom our technical partners co-locating with the library will be the team of Future Primitive, who are the builder team behind ERC 6551. With the hope to eventually evolve towards a more shared governance and ownership model, sort of inspired by that, that second wave of DAOs, without calling it a DAO yet, not taking some of the learnings from that wave of DAOs and sort of, trying to be very intentional around building our digital community around this very local and physical infrastructure. So yeah, what Jesse is showing here is sort of a glimpse at the organizational diagram of the node library, which sort of shows the programs and services model and sort of the operational and value flow around these various arms. So what we have here on the left side, let me just open it up for myself, is sort of that, that technical backend arm, which is, anchored in the node and local server operations, which will be able to provision digital services for, community APIs, RPCs, deploying storage and compute resources. And this will, in the middle section here, this is sort of the governance piece, which shows, which for the time being consists of 221A, some of our founding core institutional partners, which are some of the local universities in BC, as well as the digital community that we're hoping to grow around this project, which will incrementally take on a governance role around the node library. And then over to the right in the green section is sort of the programs and public outputs arm of what we're seeing the node library can sort of generate for the communities that we hope to serve. These include activities, in the tradition of regular libraries, collections and acquisitions, lending arm. This also includes prototyping. So this is product development of digital public goods. Also, we're hoping to deploy some of that treasury for community grants for folks in our communities to be able to experiment with some of the technical stack on their own to build technology solutions for their communities, and also to produce storytelling and editorial outputs. And then finally, sectoral advocacy and education activities. So these are, research and publication activities to produce policy positions and to hopefully move the needle among public institutions who might be, and government, agencies that are a little bit reticent still about the uptake of some of these decentralized tooling and networks. And the treasury being, fed by, I won't go through all of them, but a mix of fiat and crypto sources. That's sort of the first glimpse at the organizational diagram. And perhaps moving over to, we also did in this early business planning phase, we've done a bit of ecosystem mapping, where we see the node libraries being sort of positioned at the intersection of four key sectors. Moving from the top and sort of clockwise, we are sort of firmly rooted in the sort of Web3 digital infrastructure and DePIN segment, being that we are our core asset to start with is server infrastructure. So this is sort of the back-end ecosystem, which encompasses sort of like node and API providers, storage and cloud, indexing and querying services. So this is an arena that's obviously currently dominated by a lot of the centralized and managed services, but also this emerging DePIN segment. So there's these networks of decentralized physical infrastructure. To the right, education, advocacy, and applied research. Yes, this is more of a specialized industry segment that the Node library feels, I think, very feels a lot of affinity with in terms of our interest to sort of produce those policy positions and to advocate for in some of the larger discursive conversations around this technology. So, these include other nonprofit R&D organizations like Radical Exchange with the Plurality Institute, also think tanks and public universities. One of our early core partners on this project is Blockchain at UBC, which is the leading research cluster, Canada's leading research cluster in blockchain technology that's hosted at the University of British Columbia. Other independent research and critical design collectives and prototyping studios and co-ops. And of course, Web3 educational institutions like Kernel. The Node library also wants to be involved in knowledge production and education and training around the technology and why it matters and why, we all want to make the internet better for more of us. And then for Web3 culture, these are initiatives that really sort of gather a lot of global creator communities and networked cultural production. So these are some of the cultural DAOs that some of you might be familiar with, such as Friends with Benefits, Refraction DAO, Water and Music. These are also peers that we feel close with, that we've had conversations with over the last few years as we've been developing the concept for the Node library and some of the publics that we hope to serve. And then obviously over to the left, the art world, so these are wider national and international arts ecosystem peers. And this includes sort of like a mix of legacy arts institutions, some of whom have become engaged in that, in digital assets collections and even started, collecting NFTs, as well as, some of the specialized cultural institutions at the intersection of art and technology, like Furtherfield, like Serpentine R&D. so yeah, that's sort of like, those are some of the concentric spheres that we want to be linking our arms with, and sort of pushing our mandate forward. And right now we are in the pilot phase of this node library. So through to probably the middle of next year, we'll be setting up our servers. We will be also, we're currently working with a great developer co-op called Haifa Co-op, based mostly in Toronto, Toronto and Montreal. So we're prototyping a decentralized storage system for cultural assets. And so that we're hoping to be sort of a linchpin in building a case for the node library to become an institutional pattern for other institutions and cultural communities to practice self-governance in the digital realm.
Thank you. That's awesome. I feel like it really could not have been a more perfect deep dive in some sense. I appreciated both of the last two, the mirror board and then the concentric circles, as kind of a deep dive into what's possible. Jesse, if you're willing to put the mirror board back up for just a second, I just want to return to the quote we started with at the beginning, which suggested the internet is not a global village. Rather, it is a network that augments life in many places. And the other Miro board also shows it, I think. This one too, for sure. But what I was seeing here was you can see it and you can hear it in how Jesse and Tao spoke. They both spoke in such great detail about their locality and the decentralized web that kind of brings most of us here to kernel. And you have the pink, which is a lot of the decentralized and distributed web, and then the yellow and the blue that might be more local to Vancouver. And when we think about an internet age institution that is a network that augments life in many places, I just think that all of this is just such a good illustration of one version of that. So thank you for sharing. Thanks for putting it back on the screen. I think usually this is where we kind of move into any dialogue. If anyone has anything that they'd like to raise their hand, talk about internet age institutions, talk about the specifics of 2.
Yeah, just reading a question from the chat from Thomas. So the library is also going to have a storage library of cultural data and artifacts. Really interested in finding out how that's being done, as well as future plans you have for that in mind going forward. Yeah, so for our collection, we're looking at it as 2 collections. So we want to have a preservation collection, so maybe a Class A collection of important artworks, ephemera, and also maybe important code or some novel smart contracts in the history of that development. But we also want to have a lending collection. So we're also envisioning utility tokens as something that can be loaned, the way you might go to a library to get a subscription or borrow a CD or something like that. But if you have utility tokens for a podcast, for a book, for watching a film, maybe we can collect those and our members could have time limited kind of borrows of those loans. We're looking at a system for non-collateralized lending, which kind of sent a few students at our hackathon their brains boiling as they came from traditional kind of finance and development backgrounds. But that was a good challenge to kind of think about in a library context. And then, yeah, for the preservation of that stuff, we're really indebted to someone like Rhea Myers, who's an artist and an cypherpunk, an artist, an early blockchain developer, early member of Dapper Labs, but now independently working as an artist. On the island I am today, on Vancouver Island, which is off the coast of the city. It's about the size of Sicily, but Rhea also lives here. And she really pushed us to think about services for artists and collector communities and thinking through the future of the conservation of the culture we're creating and looking at how we can support that. So, you know, we're looking at creating potentially opportunities for people to permanently store the media attached to their creations on chain. So that's something we're working on right now with Reiko Plo, who's a former studio tenant, then did their master's at the University of British Columbia in Archival Sciences through blockchain at UBC. We met them again through a hackathon last summer that I mentioned, and then they became a board member, and then now they've stepped down from the board to finish their graduate work with us through an internship to develop kind of an early prototype for a storage system for such things, for that kind of preservation stuff. And it may be something that we could pilot with other museums, collecting institutions looking at digital assets, but also collector communities. And so if you're interested in that, actually, that's a good segue for me to say, actually, here's some more information on what Reiko is building. And if you like what she is building, you can vote for it today, because we're actually looking for some funding from the Filecoin Foundation. And that closes in about 5 hours. So do so today. Sign up for Artisan. It's a funding platform. You get a bunch of votes just for signing up. And then if you like our project, dump them all on us, please. Sorry, my audio was a bit... Was that you, Vivek?
Yep. I was just saying, if anyone else has questions, that reflection on the Fireside, happy to hear from anyone.
You might have to mute Jesse for us to hear Vivek a little bit better.
To be honest, the birds chirping might be better than me, but I was just saying that if anyone else has anything, to add into the dialogue, conversation, anything that stood out from this week, anything about the module that's an open question, really, as always, we kind of end with open dialogue. We'll have like 15 or 20 minutes more with Jesse and Tao, and then we can continue onwards a little further if we'd like. Megan, if you'd be willing, happy to have you ask out loud.
Yeah, I particularly like that quote about how contemporary art has become a global but compartmentalized safe space, like to preserve the world as it was rather than inventing what it might become. Because I do strongly believe that art, the purpose of art is to like shape and like bring forward the future. But I am curious about the industry itself, or like the reasonings for that. I don't know much about that magazine that the quote was like talking about, but why do you think it has shifted to be this way? Is it like the cultural external factors, or is it the structure of the industry itself?
I'd say money is the big one. Art is now an investment vehicle for a lot of people, and so you want to keep that market as stable as possible, and you want to create this canon that seems open and ever expanding, but is really quite narrow around its aesthetics and its access and how people find their way into it. And so if you keep that market stable and you can control that through various means, through major galleries and biennials, then, the financial system stays stable. But yeah, the art world's in financial trouble right now. A lot of the art world operated since during my days on 0% interest rate policies, which allowed people to borrow money invested in art and then resell and make money off of it when that was profitable. But now we don't have those interest rate policies, so people are scrambling and the floor is falling out from a lot of that. So we'll see where it goes. It's art's not in trouble, but the market is, we'll put it that way.
When you say art, are you particularly talking about like physical, like 2D art, or like what type of medium?
Yeah, I mean, the art markets, traditionally sculpture, painting, prints, that sort of stuff that would be in there. And then there is a subsect of that where media art has always been a part of it. Vancouver's a big part of understanding media art as part of that. Stan Douglas is a filmmaker. Most of his artwork is data, but it's very highly valued and controlled in a gallery network that you can only see those films in museums and biennials and that sort of stuff. But yeah, and now we're seeing some institutions move into collecting digital assets, but they're really just bringing the same thinking towards the new stuff, which is causing a lot of problems, I think.
Maybe Jordan's question, then Anya, and then Henry.
Okay, just
Yes.
catching up here.
I was wondering, how do you estimate the revenues from generating from node stacking? Do you think it can cover the overheads?
Not totally. So I think we just need to get involved and start to see what it is and start to experiment a little bit. So that's why when Tao was looking at the treasury, so there's different financing coming in. So there'd be fiat coming in through private philanthropy and kind of state grants to start us up. We're working with an interesting artist right now, Daniel Keller, down in LA, who's helping us doing some node forecasting. So we're looking at the DPIN space as potentially like, an opportunity for us in this next cycle to get that upswing and to create a bit of a value treasury for the node library to kind of start operating off of. But traditional validators and stuff on like layer ones and that sort of stuff, that's pretty standard, and we don't see that as a huge kind of money earner at this point. But we just want to demonstrate that, for public institutions, I think endowments are a big way they operate, and so that's an investment of capital that pays out interest every year towards the program, scholarships, fellowships, exhibitions, that sort of stuff. However, that's the same return rate as maybe a validator might offer. So could we look at institutional endowments kind of diversifying and kind of considering that as a potential source, while also providing the infrastructure needed to kind of support the culture and do kind of full stack cultural development?
Oh, okay. Thanks for the answer, detailed answer.
Anya?
Hey, thanks so much for doing all the work. It's super cool. I'm actually coming from the arts, and I was studying with Jaime Zobernik and worked with Daniel a few years back, maybe like over 7 years now ago. And when I was studying, we were always making a joke that everyone is producing art looking like it was made in the 70s. And I like your comment about biennial that now all the dead artists are being represented. I think it's like very funny because when I was studying, everyone was talking about the art world, and we were, the meme, if the VC are all with us in the same room, and we had like a similar discussion around like if the art world is even in the room with us, because we were all kind of trying to be artists, but then we ended up just creating our own like ecosystem and showing arts around each other, and it was really hard to get into some kind of spaces. And so yeah, seeing what you do really made me really happy today. It's super cool and interesting. I didn't know that Sempertine and all the other institutions are doing so much research in blockchain, because when I joined in 2021, there was so much hate from this traditional institutions. But yeah, you opened my eyes to certain practices which I didn't know existed. So thanks so much.
Yeah, check out the Serpentines program. They're a really close group for us. So of really, especially the program Victoria Ivanova runs. But they're doing a good project with Radical Exchange you should check out, called Partial Common Ownership, that's looking at rethinking the ownership of art and the royalties and the licensing behind that as a really generative thing. So yeah, they were just down at Friends with Benefits Fest a couple weeks ago, kind of presenting that work as well.
Thanks. I'll check it out.
See Mutembe, if you'd like, and then maybe a couple I missed, but Mutembe, if you'd like to ask.
Oh, okay. Hey, so this is Mtembe, kennel fellow from Kenya. And so I ended up meeting with a number of artists, both for traditional, like medicinal, a lot of indigenous knowledge here in Kenya. And their question was really, because they've heard about the Web3 space, and they were asking, okay, how do they get involved? How can they become sustainable? Because I know all these communities, all these decentralized communities we're able to create, and a lot of them are just pure creatives, right? Either for indigenous music, indigenous medicine, and or artworks. And the question was like, right now they're not able to do such things as, for example, come together as a collective and get a space or such. They usually do things like drum circles in the middle of the city and try to get some income that way. What are some of the things you can? Because I mean, I saw what you're doing in Vancouver, and that seems amazing. How would they be able to leverage, this knowledge to do that here?
I think, yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think how you connect in is through the connections you have, the relationships you have, right? I think an interesting analog to your question might be looking at someone, there's you follow him on Twitter, his name's Rafa the Builder, R-A-F-A, but he has a community kind of thinking through this called Folklore, and there's a particular project that he's Puerto Rican American and he's based in Berlin, but he's looking at how he can support a network of traditional artists, indigenous artists coming from Puerto Rico, to kind of sell their works online or create work online or create an affinity between the online communities that Rafa is developing through Folklore and the publishing they're doing, and then using his relationships to connect them to the artists. So maybe you yourself are that connection that can start to think through you're out here finding pathways into these digital networks. Now, how do you take these pathways and then connect them to the locality of the artists that you know and help find them resources that they need and the buyers or the interested parties that might be curious to hear about their work.
All right, thanks. And I've already just followed him on X.
Yeah,
so thanks.
He's been a huge voice for us, and he's so generous. So yeah, just get in touch.
Okay, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Let's see. Anyone else, if you'd like? That's perhaps double back to Christo. Looks like we're getting a lot of votes in for Artisan in the background. Christo, how did it all feel from your side today, and the relation between the network identity part and then the institutional part?
Yeah, it was all connected, no pun intended. I think it's so cool to hear all these different perspectives, and what I loved about 221 is also the cultural aspects of it, connecting all these different cultures into a physical space, bridging the digital with the physical. And yeah, that gives me a lot of like excitement for what's already here, but also what's coming.
So I want to leave space for Tao as well. Just really grateful to have, Kernel Fellows also out and doing such cool work that we can then re-engage with in new ways. And so just Tao, thank you for all that you shared. And if you have any other thoughts, I know they'd be appreciated.
Yeah, no, I feel like definitely the anchoring our digital strategy in our very physical footprint in our cultural facilities, that has become the calling card of the organization, is this growing network of cultural spaces. And the digital layer is tethered to those spaces and to those communities and to some of the histories of networked self-governance that Jesse was talking about through Chinatown. Personally also, I have family history in Vancouver, Chinatown. That was one of the reasons why I wanted to work with 221A in the first place, to sort of like see how these patterns of, maybe they're not institutional patterns, but maybe they're self-instituting patterns, self-infrastructuring patterns, can sort of like ripple through both, generations, but also layers of the stack. And the stack is not just technical, it's also, from the land, ecology, communities, um, up through, our contracts with First Nation host communities, up through, some of the more digital technical layers that the Node library is trying to build. And then always being tethered by the relationships and some of those relationships that we're knitting together through communities, digital, globally dispersed communities like Kernel. That's super, super a powerful force as well. But also not losing sight of the hyper local and the situated. I think right now more and more, just thinking back to where a lot of Web3 conversations were 2 years ago when I was part of KB5 versus now, it feels like there is a bit of a swing back towards, ideas, these sort of D-Web ideas of, local first and folk computing, slow computing, these very intentional choices rather than just, scaling by any and all means possible. I think these are some of the decisions that we have at our disposal when we're sort of like assembling our own governable stack that is dedicated to specific communities that we purport to serve. So yeah, I really like the theme of this conversation being that braiding between the hyperlocal but also the globally connected, the globally networked. And thank you for hosting us, Vivek.
Of course, yeah. Just some maybe Anna first, if you'd like, please. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Vivek. And thank you so much for that presentation. I've got this, my head is buzzing with all kinds of things. I'm actually Canadian, so I'm going to be back in Canada and Vancouver spending a few months. So just excited to know that you exist and that work exists there. I guess one thing that is on my mind, and maybe this is a bigger question, but it strikes me based on what you were just saying, Tao, and kind of some of your earlier remarks, Jesse, around like the influence of money in the art world. I think there's some really interesting, I'm here in the UK now, and there's some really interesting civic infrastructure projects like Makespace in Oxford and Civic Square in Birmingham that are sort of reimagining sort of the way that kind of citizens and residents engage with the space. And to me, the kind of through line of a lot of that and like some of the most important and difficult work is a reimagining value, because I think these organizations really struggle to get the amount of capital that's needed to do the work that is at hand. And so I think, to me, I get really excited about the ways that you're doing that in your own work, and the kind of the possibility of blockchain as being kind of one of the ways to get past that barrier of thinking, of trying to explain how to value things in a totally different way to people, rather than doing the kind of mindset shift piece, which I think is where a lot of energy goes, and it's really tough, demoralizing work. But I just wondered if like that was something that you intentionally, like how you approach that question of a total rethink of value and what has value and what should have value, and how to fund things that are valuable that maybe aren't going to be an investment in traditional terms. Thank you.
I mean, I think a lot of it just comes from our ability to understand kind of intangible cultural heritage and understanding that value has a way of playing out over cycles or longer terms. And, you know, I can't say we're there totally yet because we're still piloting this thing and it's still a struggle to try and figure out financially how this is going to work. You know, we've written maybe one of the first policies for a charitable nonprofit to actually integrate crypto into our activities. Like there's examples of charities receiving crypto, but then they just cash out into fiat, and then they put that in their bank account and they use that, and it's a fundraising mechanism so crypto holders can get tax receipts, which is a good first step. But now we're taking the step, which is how do we actually work with it and how do we engage with the infrastructure of it. So that's also a challenge for traditional nonprofit, because traditional nonprofit isn't used to owning assets, because our books are meant to even out at the end of every year, right? So it's meant to equal zero. That's not great when you have an asset that could be a little bit rambunctious. How do you account for that? So these are some questions we're trying to think about. So, but I think it's also about recognizing community participation. Like 221A, like we're the kind of network where it's like our mission is for the artists to stay in their studio. Like no one wants a situation where somebody has to leave because they don't want to leave because they don't have the resources. So because of that, during the pandemic is when we started to do it and take a bit of leadership in that. It was to think about kind of we only operate out of cost recovery through our network, so there's no kind of profit margin there, but it's kind of like in certain crunch situations where we understand the incomes of artists being so volatile and vulnerable that there'll be months or periods of time where you are fallow. So there are resources to draw on for members of 221A in the studios to kind of to survive those times. So yeah, our mission is for people to be integrated and to be stable and to have a good solid life and to be able to go to the dentist and to enjoy some time to read and spend some time with their family. So yeah, we value all those things that kind of make up a community, and we understand why they're important, I think, just at a leadership level, which, for most arts institutions, that isn't there, I'd say. It's survival, it's the hamster wheel, it's trying to be the showiest or biggest presenter kind of in the room or something like that, but yeah, we're a bit different.
I appreciate your time today, and the image, Tal, that's been sitting with me since you said it was just kind of like the ripples through time, the importance of unspoken cultural heritage. There's a quote that is kind of at the end. The way the kernel syllabus reads, I don't know if anyone has noticed this yet, but there's also these like little sentences. It says, these are the 4 briefs of the week. It says, transform consensus by inventing paradise. And paradise is the module. It's most about time. It's kind of about the garden and forking memes. And it says, the gardening games with the richest environments, the deepest stories, and the most interesting characters will attract the most people. We are time travelers now, and we might as well figure out how to imbue our digital clocks with a more ecological, human readable sense of time. This is from Illich. Each one of us and each of the groups with which we live and work must become a model of the era we desire to create. The many models which will develop should give to each one of us an environment in which we celebrate our creative response to change with others who need us. Thank you, Jesse, Tao, Christo, everybody for being here today. And if you have any last things you'd like to share, please do.
Come see us in Vancouver. We'll see you here. Or online at the Node Library, either one.
All right, y'all. Take care. Have a really good one. And we'll see everybody next week. Sign up for Expo. Bye, y'all. Bye.